I released a video a few days ago about Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, essentially a review where Nate and I talked about it after having played through the entire game over on my Let's Play channel, Degenerate Plays. The link to that is down in the description below if you're interested in checking that playthrough out. Now, I don't think I've made it any surprise or shock that I didn't care for this game very much, but I am surprised to the extent of which it wasn't really for anyone. And so, I believe just a day or two after I recorded that video and posted it, and a lot of you agreed with it, I was surprised to see that Jason Schreier, who was often associated with video game journalism, and I would say is actually one of the people who really does break stories with video games. Like, I'm talking goes and will interview people, will actually try and find out what happened. I don't know how he does it, because everyone I reach out to in the video game industry ignores me, but somehow he does it. Somehow he actually gets a hold of these people, and he actually is able to talk to a lot of them. Well, he released a piece on Bloomberg about Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, and just some of the tumultuous development and awful things going on behind the scenes when it came to this game not actually coalescing into something good. Now, one of the first things was just a full-on confirmation, by the way, that there was a Suicide Squad game in the works at WB Games Montreal, something that I'm hoping to hear more about in the future, because that sounded a lot more like it was more of the traditional follow-up to what they had built by the end of Batman Arkham Origins, but that it was actually shifted into development by Rocksteady, by management, because they wanted them to basically capitalize on the success of the 2016 Suicide Squad movie, which we knew was kind of going on with this. It was pretty obvious looking at the game that there were elements from the movie, from the aesthetics all the way down to the casting of Deadshot, which personally, I don't really care. But I mean, like, it is pretty forced to say, like, no, actually, the white Deadshot that's not the Deadshot from here. This is a different Deadshot. Like, that guy was a fake and he's from Earth 2. And, you know, like all these random things they threw in the game. It was very obviously a pretty stupid way to just be like, oh, let's make him look vaguely similar to Will Smith by being black. And that's it. It doesn't matter, but it was obvious that, like, that's what they were doing, and it was very obvious that they were trying to play off the success of that movie, at the very least in the concept stage and in the stage of its aesthetic inspiration. Well, a lot of that was confirmed in this Bloomberg article, and if you want to read through it, there is actually a Reddit post which I believe gifts the article to people who click on it. So if you want to read this, I've linked the actual Reddit post where you can go, and then from there, you can go to read the whole thing yourself. But I wanted to touch on a couple of very interesting points to me in this entire behind the scenes look. So if you do enjoy this video, please be sure to leave a like, subscribe for more content. I am hoping this is probably the last we'll really talk much about Suicide Squad for a long time, because unlike Batman Arkham or a lot of these other things, I'm not really passionate about it. It's more just like, I am passionately interested in this big and grand scale of a blunder in the superhero gaming space. Something this article gets into that I find very fascinating is not only was there that Suicide Squad game being made by WB Games Montreal, which got kind of pulled from them and restarted essentially with Rocksteady, but also Rocksteady was working on a different game before this, but it wasn't anything that any of us would have guessed. It was a multiplayer puzzle solving game codenamed Stones. And hey, you know what? They still must have had some stones to release Suicide Squad in the state it was in, so I guess it lived on in some way or another. But around 2016, Sefton Hill and Jamie Walker, the co-founders of Rocksteady Studio, who some of you might remember actually left the studio now to found their own studio, well, they were basically introducing to the Rocksteady team that they had now pivoted to working on Suicide Squad. And it's interesting because they refused to be interviewed for the story, but that kind of is very common when it comes to anything where there's a big mistake or big blunder on the scale of Suicide Squad, which, if you're in the camp who still thinks it isn't, David Zaslav admitted was like a $200 million disappointment. Essentially that it had cost them that much in one way or another, and that its failure had overshadowed the entire quarter that they were talking about on the earnings call that this was discussed on as well, which is crazy to me because I do want to mention that a game I absolutely love, Metal Gear Solid 5, only had like an $80 to $90 million budget from Konami. That game is fantastic. I would argue that it should have had a little bit more put into it. It's very obvious that they rushed it out at the end. You know, probably the whole situation with Hideo Kojima. My point is, I find it interesting that that game, which I would argue is hundreds of times better than Suicide Squad, was made on less than half the budget of this game. But one thing I do find very fascinating about this is it also confirms something that Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League defenders have been denying for a long time, which is that this game has been in development for a very long time. A lot of people were saying, nuh-uh, they must have been working on something else first, it must have gotten canceled. Obviously, games take a long time to make, but there's no way it's been being worked on in some form or another since 2016. Well, actually, it was confirmed that pretty much around 2016 was the time that they were starting work on this. So this game took 7 years, essentially, to come out, and it was a $200 million blunder when it came to the studio. So I do find it interesting, and this is something Jill, my wife, said in the background when we were talking, but all those years that we were waiting for maybe an Arkham game or a Superman game or anything like that, right? Well, this was actually being worked on since 2016, a year after the launch of Batman Arkham Knight. Now, it's interesting because there were other things going on and being floated at WB Games in general. I don't know to what extent, but there was that, Suicide Squad game from WB Games Montreal. There was also obviously what has been kind of called Project Sabbath, which had a lot of its promotional art, or I should say concept art, released online, which we've talked about before. So there were things going on there, but this is a game that Rocksteady in some form or another has been working on since 2016. That said, even though they had actually settled on Suicide Squad, there was a whole presentation where essentially they were looking at it and saying, well, the industry is growing fixated on games as a service like Destiny and League of Legends. They basically generate sales long after their initial release. So we should do that too. And there was a whole presentation with Warner Bros. Execs in London where they made the case that that category was the gaming industry's future. Just entirely, that was its future, which is kind of mind-boggling and very out of touch, but I guess at the time that's what they thought it was going to be. So Rocksteady started working on this game, and they started trying to make these changes to it and make this game into something that kind of resembled something like Destiny, a game that would get people coming back to it over and over and over again. And they were even keeping it a secret from potential hires because they didn't want this leaking out. They didn't want people knowing what they were working on at the time. It's actually funny because reading through this article, there's a lot of things that we asked as questions as fans of these superhero adjacent characters, like these characters from a DC Comics universe, right? Like, for example, why would Captain Boomerang be using guns more than his boomerang? Questions like that were actually asked by members of the team, and they weren't met with any good answers. Now, keep in mind, that is something that a lot of us were kind of wondering is, well, why did it go this way? And it's actually because originally the focus of this game was going to be on melee combat, but it then changed towards a shift towards guns. So some might ask why they switched to guns, and that's something that the studio was asking themselves. I think it's pretty obvious though that when it comes down to it, it was another one of these things that, like the games they were trying to copy, they needed a reward you could get over and over again, and they also needed a reward that could change its stats and actually be slightly more valuable next time you play. This is something that if you are familiar with games as a service games or these shooter games that are like that, a lot of times that's what it is. Like, you're trying to get a better shader, or you're trying to get, another drop, or you're trying to get the same gun you have but with different perks, or the same gun you have with 10 more damage. Now, as somebody who put over 700 hours, I believe, into the original Destiny and a couple hundred hours into Destiny 2, I was someone who was very much into this type of game at one point. I'm not anymore, really. And so I do understand how these games work, and that is why they were going in that direction. Now, it's worth mentioning that this game was originally supposed to come out in something like 2019 or 2020, and it was not actually going to be released for many, many years after that. And there were a lot of frustrations going on behind the scenes as well. Essentially, they said that sometimes Sefton Hill was a perfectionist, that he would review their work, he'd take weeks to do so, and basically he would slow down the game development and scrap big chunks of the script and didn't convey his ideas as they changed. They also said that he confessed that he hadn't spent much time with competing games like Destiny, so essentially that he didn't actually understand what he was doing with this game. And also, as mentioned by this article, at one point Hill pitched an elaborate system of vehicles that would allow players to deck out their cars with weapons and navigate through the game's alien-infested streets. But essentially they couldn't actually do that because there was already all of these ways of traversing, essentially. So they're like, well, why would you put King Shark on a motorcycle when he could just soar through the air? And essentially they spent months of prototyping and messing with this, and that vehicle system was scrapped entirely. And several employees adopted the term, which I've never heard, but I find this interesting, toxic positivity, to describe the culture of the company, which discouraged any criticism essentially of the game. And apparently even when games like Marvel's Avengers came out, a game that I'd say is probably more fun to me than Suicide Squad, just because even though it's a little repetitive, at least the story felt respectful to me. That said, games like that didn't even do very well, and Rocksteady leaders Jamie Walker and Sefton Hill apparently weren't worried about it at all for whatever reason. And Rocksteady staff was actually surprised that they were leaving. Now, they didn't actually share their reasons for leaving when they left and they founded 100 Star Games, but essentially they told potential recruits from Rocksteady that they would have the opportunity to make a game free of the mandates and pressures from a corporation like Warner Bros., which is very interesting to me because, well, it seems like they essentially are the people who pushed it entirely in this direction and actually pushed the team behind the scenes into so many corners that ended up hurting the game more and more and more. Now, something I find interesting that was not actually discussed in this article was some of the story beats that I think were very obviously directed heavily by current political trends. Now, we've talked about this before, like there's a lot of in-your-face messaging in Suicide Squad, which no matter what side of any spectrum you fall on, I think people noticed and found preachy and annoying. Even elements like fundamentally changing Harley Quinn, painting her just as a victim of the Joker and circumstance, getting rid of her old costumes and moving entirely in a different direction, changing Deadshot to be a totally different character based off of the movie and not based off of what was already in the Arkhamverse. Like, essentially, they were chasing a lot of trends, be it political, ideological, business, and they all fell flat, I would say, right on their face. I find this whole thing interesting to me, and there's a lot more information in this article, like I said, if you want to check it out. But one of the things that's so fascinating to me is that this paints a pretty bad picture of Rocksteady in general. A lot of people did leave to join 100 Star Games when Jamie Walker and Sefton Hill left. So, I mean, obviously a lot of people don't blame them for the things that happened, but I do find it telling that the games without Paul Dini's involvement, actually, like Batman Arkham Knight, I would say had the most issues with its story coalescing completely. And then you also have games like this where he wasn't involved and Sefton Hill was one of the main pushers behind it, and it really didn't turn out very good. But that said, it's kind of making me wonder how much of that influence when it came to a story side actually came from external influences like Paul Dini. Regardless, I'd be interested in your opinion on all of this because it's certainly painting a not great picture of Rocksteady, a not great picture of Rocksteady's co-founders, who seem to have pushed for this game and then bailed to avoid criticism. That's essentially the look that I would say this leaves with the audience, and Luna apparently agrees down in the background of the video. So if you enjoy this, please be sure to leave a like, subscribe for more content. I appreciate you very much. I want to say a big thank you to some of our Patreon supporters and members. I haven't done a thank you for a little bit. I've been very, very busy, but I do appreciate all of you. If you want to support this channel, there are all the normal ways to do so, including our store, cosmobunny.shop, where we have new repurposed comic book and manga resin pieces from comics and manga that were damaged that couldn't be sold. We take them, my wife Jill does an amazing job turning them into resin coasters, keychains, and more for your home. And we also do have handmade beaded jewelry over there as well, which I think is fantastic. You can use code DJAY123 for 10% off your first order, or if you're a fan of other online games, there's one that I'm actually a big fan of, which is Fortnite. And if you want to support us on that, we have a creator code, which is DJAY123. A lot of you have been very generous and supportive with that. We appreciate it very much. You know, a little behind the scenes look, these channels don't actually make a ton of money. I really enjoy doing them, but stuff like that does help support them, and I appreciate it. And I appreciate you too. Have a fantastic day, and as always, everyone, stay shui.